All right. Well, welcome everybody to now our sixth event of our Federal Monthly Business Application Series. My name is Steve Winward. I'm a technical director for our U.S. Federal team, and I'm really excited to be able to be with you all today. In terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to do a few things. We're going to speak about this community and some updates around what we've been doing for this community. We're going to share with you all some product updates that we've had since the last time we got together. And then our main session, brought to you by John Landgrave, is going to be all around how do you leverage Power Platform to build low-code applications and quickly build low-code applications on top of existing SAP legacy workloads. And I wanted to make a shout out to Josh. I don't know if Josh is in the audience today, but thanks to you, this was a great feature request that we had for this community, and this is how we actually got the idea for this topic. So thank you, Josh, for that. And then what we'll do is we'll have a Q&A session at the end after the main session. If you all have questions, you're welcome to ask questions at that time. I also just wanted to share with everybody that this is our Microsoft Digital Code of Conduct. I'm not going to read the entire thing here, but to summarize, please just be respectful of everybody in the audience and as well as the people speaking today. If anybody is not being respectful of other people, we do have the right to remove you from this call. I also wanted to take a second and just share with you all, when you signed up for this event with the sign-in page, we did collect your email. I want to be as transparent as possible about what do we use that email for. It's a couple of things. One is we will send you a follow-up note after we have this video recorded and published on YouTube, so you know where to get that and you can watch it after the fact. We'll also use that email to then send you future updates. So the next event that we have a month out, we will then give you an update to let you know what's going to be coming next. And so that is really the scope of why we collect the email. If at any point you want to be removed from that email list, please just reach out to us directly and we will make sure to take you off of that. And you will no longer receive any future email correspondence from us about this event. In terms of logistics of how this works, we are using Teams. And so what we're going to be doing is for the main session, both this intro as well as the main session for SAP, we ask you to just use the chat feature. And we've got people that are going to be moderating the chat in real time. So if there are breaks in the session, we can then ask those in real time to be able to ask those questions. If you don't get your question answered then, what we're also going to do is have a Q&A session at the end of this where we'll let people come off of mute. The way we'll do that is we're just going to use the Teams hand raise feature, and we'll then allow for anybody in the audience to be able to come off of mute at that point. So if you have questions, oh, and the other thing too is that at that section, we'll also no longer be recording the event either. Now, for this community, we've been trying to make as robust of a community as possible around business applications for Federal. And so we are absolutely committed to doing that. Here's a screenshot of the landing page we have on GitHub, which we can have a link in the chat as well. And what this does is this just shows you all of the past webinar sessions that we've held so far. And if you click on that, it'll actually take you to the recording of the video on YouTube. We've also taken that a step further that on YouTube, we have timelines built into the videos. So if you want to go specific to what were the updates for this month, you can do that. If you want to go specific to what was the main event, you can get to that really easily. And then on this page, we'll also have the next registration link. So whatever the next month's topic's going to be, you click that link, that'll take you to the registration page to be able to sign up for that. And a new thing we just started, if you go to that page right now, you can see we have show notes for the May session, for this session right now. So when we reference links in the intro overview, as well as links in the main session, we can then update that. So you have one place to go back to find all those references as well. And I also wanted to just take a second to overview what is it that we call business applications from a Microsoft perspective. So on this one hand, we have Office 365, and those are our collaboration products we all love and use today. Things like PowerPoint, SharePoint, Outlook. All of those things, for the most part, are pretty much out of the box. You install them, you can use them. Outlook, for example, if you install it, you can then just start getting email for your organization right away. There's not a lot of configuration when you do that. On the other extreme, from a Microsoft perspective, we have Azure. Azure are really our world-class developer services that you can build incredibly robust applications on top of those services. In the middle is where business application fits in. First, we have Power Platform. That's really our low-code application platform that you can build incredibly secure mobile-first applications with just a few clicks and a few drags, and you can be able to build those applications and deploy them for your agency. On top of Power Platform, we have Dynamics. You can think of Dynamics as really first-party applications built on top of the Power Platform. And the idea here is that if you have a use case that fits into one of these applications, you can take advantage of that right away. Customer service is one of those. It's a modern call center, a modern contact center that you can deploy for your federal agency and be able to start taking support calls from US citizens and route them appropriately to the people that can best help. You can also take advantage of different forms of communication. So it could be a phone call, it could be an SMS text, it could be Facebook or WhatsApp. Any of those different forms hook into customer service, and we have those out of the box ready to go. And so for the purposes of this community, everything in that red box is what we're going to be talking about. Specifically today, we're going to be zooming into Power Platform with how you can integrate with SAP. I also wanted to take a second to acknowledge that Microsoft has made an incredible investment to build dedicated data centers and footprints for US federal customers. And so we meet FedRAMP and FedRAMP requirements and other federal regulations. And so if you hear the term GCC, that's Government Community Cloud, and we have a couple flavors of that. So there's GCC, GCC High, DoD, and really Microsoft is committed to meeting whatever the federal regulations and requirements are. We will meet those to support you in your cloud journey from a business applications perspective. And now we wanted to share with you a couple specific updates that we've had since the last time we've gotten together. The first one is we did put together a brief topic in terms of how can you create support tickets specific to Power Platform or Dynamics. So we have a link on our GitHub repository, and this will provide you the direct links, whether you're GCC, GCC High, or DoD, of how you can get to the support site and create a ticket. If you have a dedicated customer success account manager for Microsoft, that would be your point person to go to. If you're experiencing anything that you think is unusual, you think this may be a bug, absolutely talk to them. If you don't have one of those assigned to your account, this support site is the way to go and is the fastest path to resolution to be able to resolve any issues that you might have along the way. I also wanted to share that we've been really committed to trying to be as transparent as possible in this community and building a lot of great content for you all for the federal space. And the thing that I'm really proud to share with you all today is that somebody on my team, Craig Harris, actually created a YouTube video of how we run our team's webinar events using Microsoft Teams. It's a little meta, but it's really cool because we've actually open sourced how we use Microsoft Teams webinar events to host exactly this kind of session. So if you're interested in that, take a look at the link. It's a great video and a great overview of how we actually do this at Microsoft. I also wanted to share that in the last session, we covered all things how developers can extend the Power Platform by Dave Milton. And since then, we released a video on YouTube specific to how could you, if you were a developer and you wanted to do CI/CD or DevOps pipelines with Power Platform, how you can do that in GCC today. And so we've got a great video on that with a sample GitHub repository that'll get you started really quickly. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out that video too. And then along those lines, when you talk about developers extending Power Platform and developers working side by side with low-code makers, we've recently released a free ebook on how you can actually set up Fusion development teams for your agency, for your organization. So that's a great resource that you can take advantage of as well. I also wanted to make a shout out to the community. Bill Blancett did a phenomenal job of going over his recommendations and his guidelines in terms of building a deployment strategy with the Power Platform. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, definitely it's a fantastic read. And thank you again, Bill, for your contributions to the community. I also wanted to just make a shout out that when you're in GCC, GCC High, and DoD, we're also committed to being as transparent as possible around which features are available today in those different clouds. And if we have a roadmap, we'll also acknowledge when do we roughly think that that feature will land if it's not there today. Definitely a good resource to have in your back pocket when you're working in these environments. And it's just another way that we're trying to be transparent in terms of what are the features available today, because we know that there are some slight differences there versus commercial with our government clouds. And lastly, before we get started to the main event, I just wanted to make a call out to this survey. So in terms of feedback, we would greatly appreciate any feedback you have from this session, good and bad ways that we can improve. We'd love to hear that. And additionally, if there's a topic that you would like to see more of or something you would like to see in the future, please use this survey to let us know. That's exactly how we got to come to this SAP topic that we're going to be covering today. And now with that, I wanted to introduce John Landgrave. He's a Power Platform Global Black Belt Technical Specialist and has done a number of things, including a very amazing video all around governance and setting that up for your environment. And today, what he's going to be talking about is our approach to integrating with SAP, leveraging the Power Platform. So John, please take it away.
Thank you, Steve. So, as Steve mentioned, today we're going to talk about different methods and practices for integrating SAP with the Power Platform. So we'll first go into some brief discussion about the Power Platform itself and you know, how you can utilize it and kind of the approach we're taking around connections. And then we'll spend some time talking about kind of best practices around the types of things you would use SAP integration for. And then talk about the different ways you can do that, and then we'll do a brief demo just to show you kind of what the mechanics are for doing those connections. So briefly, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail around the Power Platform because I know you're aware of the kind of the no code, low code, and there, of course there's Mo code and code first. And as Steve mentioned, it really is about not just citizen developers being able to create applications, but also the ability to integrate and to work hand in hand with professional developers or code first developers to create these integrations. And in the SAP space, this is one of those features you'll generally take advantage of. And we'll talk later on about how you can use your SAP or pro developers to do some of the initial setup to create kind of an agility layer for you that can be generally consumed by your no code and low code developers. So we don't really expect that citizen developers or folks who are relatively new to the platform would have the wherewithal to go through and use a fairly complex system like SAP. So we'll want to talk through how we would enable that access in a simple way. And really the way to think about this is that if you can turn your organization into a set of APIs, and those APIs behind them will manage most of the governance and the security and selecting the right environments, for example, then you can make it very simple for end users using no code or low code tools to be able to go through and create applications, but to make sure that those applications are actually following the rules of the organization and of the underlying systems. And so even though we have these connectors out of the box with lots of triggers and actions, the reality is that for SAP today, SAP is a fairly large system with thousands of integration points, which are called BAPIs or business APIs. And then those business APIs have to be mapped into something that Power Platform can consume. And so generally the way we're going to do that is by using the connector that comes with the Power Platform, but then wrapping that connector with some logic that makes it easily consumable by someone using one of the other features of the Power Platform. And I think it's important to point out that once that connector is in place, once that API is built, then any Power Platform feature they can call an API, which is all Power Platform features, including Power Apps or Power Automate or Power Virtual Agents or even AI Builder, can go through and use this API to begin consuming SAP data. So what is SAP? I mean, SAP is really the industry standard ERP system across not just the government, but also across most major enterprises. Its primary focus is in manufacturing, sales and distribution, life sciences, and HR. But again, the value of the platform is that it's highly customizable. And so you have industries who can where individual companies or government or individual agencies can build their own interfaces, and yet a lot of the standard SAP backend doesn't get modified. And so it makes it very easy to customize it. But of course, when you customize something, that also potentially means it's more difficult when you want to upgrade or make other changes. And so SAP does a very good job as a system of insulating users from or system developers from those changes to make it easy as upgrade comes through to continue using the system. So again, it's highly customizable. Things you have to be aware of is that generally customers don't modify standard SAP screens because that would break the update path. So what that means is the screen itself or the underlying API that calls it is generally consistent across multiple implementations, which means that if we build APIs that access these underlying business APIs that are basically equate to different screens in SAP, then we can have some confidence that we could use the same methodology against multiple different SAP instances and not have an issue with the API breaking. There's also this concept, we won't get into it deeply, but there's this concept of a user exit where on a particular screen, I can say, this is behavior I want for this screen, or this is a behavior I want for this API, and it sits outside of the actual API. So upgrades can take place, and the only changes you have to make are to the actual customizations that you've made, but it doesn't stop the upgrade process from happening. So why would you want to use SAP with a Power Platform? What we're seeing today is customers extending the Power Platform using SAP for some fairly specific use cases. One of the primary ones is to build a task-based application that would make some kind of data entry or some other end process much simpler to accomplish. The reason this is important is that for SAP, it's sometimes necessary to go to multiple screens and enter the same data on each of those screens, and then save each screen before you can move on to another screen to do a process. And so one of the things that's very powerful by using Power Platform in this scenario is to go through and consolidate the data entry points from those multiple screens to put the data into one place, and then under the covers, when you save the screen, to go call the APIs in the order required to make sure that everything gets saved. And so this will save minutes and sometimes hours of time if you have a large number of people using this task-based application in aggregate, because instead of navigating between screens and moving to multiple points, you're able to go through and do a single entry. The other thing that's very useful is if I have SAP, but I've also got other systems I'm integrating with, then being able to build applications or reports that integrate those two things is very powerful by using the SAP connector and the underlying APIs, along with the other ones that you create. Other common things that we see people do with this connector is they would build applications that would integrate with other systems, and those other systems would have their own devices. And so some example of this would be, call center integration. So I want to do a screen pop when when a customer comes in and I want to pop the screen with a picture up or an integration to a particular API, along with things like using warehouse scanners. So the ability to take a scanner out, scan information, and feed that stuff directly into SAP. This is incredibly useful with things like the Power Platform, where we have scanning capability and barcode reading capability in the platform. Another common use case is mobile access to a particular system. So for example, we've been working with one of the Armed Forces divisions to go create applications that can do things like offline collection of data with respect to doing inspections or repairs, and then being able to basically extend SAP to a mobile device, even in some cases to be able to do offline access to that. And then other examples would be things like integrating with web pages. So for example, we have had customers who will go build an API that uses RPA, where they find something on Amazon, and once they find it on Amazon, they can click an order this button and have that go through and push the order directly into SAP, even though they're using the web page to go find the item they want. I mentioned offline applications, and so this is one of the kind of key areas of being able to use. And then there are also cases where you need approval workflows. So those workflows don't exist inside of SAP. And so I'm going to either build my own custom workflow engine inside of SAP, using creating my own custom tables, or I can use the approvals engine inside of Flow, or even business process flows as part of Dataverse, and be able to go in and integrate with data both inside and outside of SAP, and to control those workflows through the Power Platform rather than having to go customize SAP to support them. The one caveat I do want to give you is that what's generally very inefficient, and what will also have the folks on the SAP team scratching their heads as to why you're doing this, is just rebuilding the screens in SAP generally isn't a great idea. We do have people who say, well, I want to pretty them up, I want to make them look better, et cetera. But the reality is that an SAP developer with access to SAP tools, it's much easier for them to go build additional screens or to modify the SAP screen. So generally speaking, it's not a good investment of time to go through and just rebuild a screen. Now, if you're rebuilding a process across multiple screens, as one of the first example is, then that's generally a really good use of the capability. So now we look through kind of what are the top level use cases for why you do that. Let's look at what your options are for going in and creating this integration. So again, for anything in the Power Platform, once you've built some kind of a connector, then you have the ability to go in and grab and modify that data. Specifically for SAP, there are 4 different ways that you can integrate with SAP. The first, and the one that we'll discuss in the most detail, is using the actual connector. Okay, and so by using the ERP connector, what's actually happening is you're loading the connector inside of Flow. You're then using the data gateway, and that data gateway is actually hosting the connection to SAP. And then anytime you make an API call, or you call one of what we call the SAP BAPIs, those calls are being invoked from the data gateway itself, and then passing that data back up through the Flow. And so this does allow you to call any BAPI or any custom RFC. And so basically any data in SAP you're able to get to through this mechanism. Now there are some other ways to do this. I should point out that the SAP connector really just goes at the core SAP data, whether it's in the more classic ECC environment or the new SAP S/4HANA environment. However, if you want to connect to other SAP elements like SuccessFactors or Concur or other systems, then you would need to use one of these other methodologies. The first is basically creating a custom connector that uses the OData API that's exposed by SAP. And so that's one way to go in and access the system, is by creating a custom connector against OData. You can also use a custom connector and do an HTTP connection and call the REST APIs directly. Keep in mind, in either of these scenarios, you have to really understand what those OData endpoints are. You're not getting a lot of prompts back that tell you potentially what fields are required and that kind of information. So there's not a lot of intelligence when you're building this connector. So it requires you to do a lot of your own research in terms of what the BAPI requires or supports. But again, it's possible to build these things, and it's the only way to build them to access the non-core SAP data. Another approach is to use the Power Automate desktop and to use the SAP GUI and to call directly into the SAP GUI. So effectively do screen scraping against the SAP GUI for Windows, and then go in and drive those changes back. So again, here are 4 different ways to access SAP data. And depending on your business requirements, one of these may make more sense than the other. But the primary thing we're going to focus on is this first method, which is using the data gateway to make the call. I should also point out that in the method we're using, as in any of these methods, one of your major concerns is going to be being able to make sure that the ID of the person who's making the call is passing through, as opposed to the call being proxied in some way. And so one of the beauties of the SAP connector approach is that if you share an application with someone who is going to go in and access SAP, then the connector itself will force them to authenticate and create their own connection, and then they'll be using their own connection to go through and access the different services. So it's a good way to ensure that the permissions and authorizations for the person accessing the system are being honored by SAP, and that's all handled automatically through the connector. So how would I actually go through and implement this? Basically, as you go through to begin building out your SAP integration infrastructure, it generally makes sense to start by thinking about, well, who are the different personas who are going to be involved in building this out, and what's the right way for me to go build this in a way that's going to be reusable and secure and easy to update. And so generally there are three personas involved. There's a BAPI developer. So this is someone whose basically career is going out and building or modifying these SAP business APIs. And they have a deep understanding of what the APIs are, what the underlying tables are that are being accessed, what fields are being required, what kinds of data and data types will be returned. And so generally you'll want to have that person from the SAP side engaged. So as you go decide, these are the APIs that I need to call for my particular use case, then they can help you understand kind of what are those required fields, what kinds of values will be returned, what other requirements are there for a particular API. The integration developer is someone who will go through and work with the BAPI developer to take those BAPIs from SAP and to bring the data back, and then to shape the data before it gets returned through a flow. And so you may get, some SAP calls can return 200 or 300 or 500 values columns. And so, generally speaking, as a best practice, what you want to do is return the values that you need to use from the API and discard the others. And so what you're going to want to do is kind of build up this integration API, and that API is what will be used by your end users. And when you've done this work in advance, then an application developer, someone who is really just a citizen developer in a low or no code environment, can use these different APIs that have been shared with them through a flow without having to really understand much about what's going on with the underlying API, other than the fact that they would call a particular API. So for example, if the integration developer has a version of the API that's supposed to be used by Power Apps developers, then they can go into the API and put in what the Power Apps, what we call an ask in Power Apps trigger. And then the Power App developer, when they load the API up into their app, will simply see a list of values they have to put in order to call the API. And then when they get the values back, those values can be stored in a collection, which can be manipulated inside of the Power App. So again, whether it's a Power App or a Power Automate Flow or even a Power Virtual Agent, the process basically is call the API that's been written for you, and then you'll get back a collection of data that comes back from the underlying API, and then you can use that collection any way that you need to. So as a general practice, we like to think about it, and this is kind of what we see from customers now, is they're building what they'll call their enterprise agility layer. And so this agility layer basically is a set of Power Automate flows, and the flows that are calling underlying BAPIs using this connector infrastructure. The beauty of the Power Platform is that I can go through and take this agility layer, which basically is a solution that is composed of one or more flows with one or more connection references that call the underlying SAP system. I can take those, create a managed solution out of it, and then just by deploying that managed solution inside of an end user environment, that end user can go through, or that citizen developer can go through, go in that environment, create a new asset, Power Automate, Virtual Agent, et cetera, and they will then see those flows available to them that are calling the underlying business APIs. So it's easy once you've developed this layer to package it and distribute it and put it out there in a way that it can be consumed by citizen developers. And then as updates of that solution happen, either because the BAPIs are changed or versions are changed, I can just redeploy that managed solution into the environment, and they would get all those updates automatically. So let's just take a real quick look at what this looks like from a solution perspective. So what you're looking at here is the Flow Designer. And in the Flow Designer, what I've started doing is modeling out what an SAP BAPI would look like. It would bring back for me a list of banks. And so, for example, I have to know what the individual types are that are required to call the BAPI. And so you'll notice here I'm passing in a country string and then the maximum number of rows that should be returned. And so this is an HTTP request because it's easier to test and exercise it that way. But if I wanted to consume this from Power Apps, I would simply delete this trigger and add the trigger back, add a trigger back that's the Power Apps trigger. And then in that Power Apps trigger, I would have it pass in a country parameter and a max rows parameter, and then the rest of the flow basically stays the same. But so again, the idea here is by creating an HTTP request first, this lets me do some editing and exercising, and then when I'm ready, I would convert this to a particular trigger that could be used, whether it's coming from Power Virtual Agents or other Power Automate flow or coming from Power Apps. But this, I'm just showing you in the more generic form so we can walk through kind of how it works. So I pass in the country and the max rows. And now these are the fields that are required by this particular business API, okay? Now I know this because when I go through and I enter my system information, I'll also enter in the name of the particular BAPI that I'm going to call. And so in this particular case, I'm calling the bank get list business API. And what the connector will do is go query SAP and say, what are the required parameters that I need in order to call this API? And you'll notice it brings back at the top of this the different parameters that are required. And so now I can simply set those. So I could hard code them if I'm doing testing, or in this particular case, because I passed them into the HTTP request, I can simply drop the values in and then encode those into the form data when I'm calling this particular API. As I mentioned before, if I had removed this and put in the Power Apps trigger, I could simply go in and use the ask in Power Apps values and put them in there. The bottom line is that what I'm doing is I'm encoding the values into this particular API call so that when it makes the call, it will return, it will pass in those values. So once I pass the values in and make the call, I'm going to go in and I'm going to get a return, and that return will come back in the body of the flow. And what I've done then is I've recorded the different types that will come in and created the listing, if you will, for what gets returned. And we'll look at some of the underlying data and walk through this process in just a second to see what's happening. All right. And then my final step is to respond and to send back a response. And so what I'm doing is I'm sending back the list of the banks that was returned. Okay.
Hey, John, quick question on what you just showed there. And I just wanted to kind of like emphasize this one. So when you actually selected the function type going to SAP, the UI actually automatically then showed you the parameters you could pass to that function. Is that correct?
Right. So it comes back and shows me what the required ones are. And you'll also notice it will also bring back all the potential values to pass. Yeah. In this particular case, there are only, a handful of values. There are some SAP calls where this list could be 100 or 200 entries long.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just wanted to emphasize that point because to me, when we talk about low code, that is really awesome, right? It's able to interpret the web service real time, dynamically give you the fields that you could have and what could be returned. I just think that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and now, so the other thing to keep in mind, just want to make sure we're back in the right context, is that the work that I'm doing here is work that is generally going to be done by that integration developer role that I mentioned before. So, even in that integration developer role, we're really kind of looking at them in that no code role where they're going in and simply defining what the API is going to be, what the values are that have to be sent into the API, and then what the shape is of the data that's coming back. Now, when I'm actually acting in that app developer role, I'm simply consuming this flow And I'm just going to see that I need to pass in these two values, and this is the list of data I'm going to get back. So for the application developer, we can make it incredibly simple.
Got it. No, thank you for that clarification. That's awesome. Yeah, so it's like it's easy for the integrator, but then we're going to make it even easier for the low-code makers to consume this.
Correct. If I go and look in this particular one, and so when I actually call the function, you'll notice here I've got one that's 42 minutes ago, and I just called it again from one of my test harnesses. And now what you see is I had one that just happened 15 seconds ago. So just to make sure that you could see how I was actually making that function call. And now what I can see is what actually happened. So I made this call and I passed in the value US for country and 999 for max rows. It then calls the BAPI. When it calls the BAPI, you'll notice that it has assigned the bank country and the rows. And then it sends back the different values that came back. So this is another thing that's kind of unique to SAP, is that SAP will return multiple record sets. And so there's one set of records that says, was this successful or not? And so the fact that I've gotten these zeros and I have no, so this is the number of errors, I have none, right? And then I can also get back a particular set of data. So this is my list of banks. So it's not incredibly useful, right? But so here's the bank city. The bank key is the RTN, the routing transit number, and then the bank name and the city. So those are the default values that get passed back unless I specify other values. Okay. And then here is the entire body. So you'll notice here's my return set, here's my bank list set, and this is the body that's bringing back returns at the top, and then the bank list here. So this is another reason why, that integration developer is someone who needs to understand things like JSON file formats. So they can see that, oh, well, this body is actually passing me back two different sets of data. And the end user who's consuming this doesn't really need to know about the return data. What they want is the actual list. And so when I go to do the parse JSON, I'm actually just sending out the bank list data. And so in the response, you'll notice that all that's going back are the banks. So I'm not passing back any of that other data. So there will be cases in more complex APIs where the data that comes back may not be shaped the right way. So say, for example, that you want to return back the city, state, and zip. And in this particular case, those things are 3 different values in 3 different columns. Well, I can use parse JSON along with some of the other data operations that are part of Power Automate flows and go through and do things like concatenate those fields together and return those values back instead of returning back a single field. So again, the idea is that integration developer who has this more advanced knowledge of not only how to integrate with SAP, but also things like how to do JSON data parsing, et cetera, can go through and shape the data so that when it actually goes back to the end user, it's coming back in a shape that they understand. It's something that's easy for them to consume. So let me stop there for any other questions about just the general overall process.
And hey, John, we did get a question from the audience in the chat just now. It was a 2-part question. The first was, does the SAP API need to be registered with Azure Active Directory before using it? And the follow-on question to that was, is there any cost to use the SAP API?
Okay, good question. So because this is an out-of-the-box connector that comes with the Power Platform, you don't have to register this particular connector, okay? So you don't need to register the connector if you were building your own connector and it needed to take some permission from Azure Active Directory or some other Azure resource to pass that through the connector. So in this particular case, being an out-of-the-box connector, it doesn't have to be registered. However, it is a premium connector. So anyone who uses an application that is that consumes one of these APIs that we've covered would need to have a premium license. And so whether that premium license is with a per app or per user, or whether it's consumed by the pay-as-you-go license, which we'll be releasing in GCC later this summer, it still has to have that premium license because it's not a standard connector, it's a premium connector. The other thing to recognize is that to use the SAP API, because we're going to pass that user's credential in through the API to SAP, that user would have to have an SAP account, and their SAP account would have to have permissions. They would have to have authorizations on the SAP side to the particular tables that are being called or the APIs that are being called. Okay, so again, you're not whatever you would have a premium license to be able to consume the Power Platform, and then you would have to have an SAP license to sign to that user, and then that SAP license assigned to that user would have to have the appropriate authorizations to go back and get the underlying data. So it's really no different than if you're using SQL or Oracle or anything else. You're going to have the premium license that allows you to use the connector itself, but then the backend service, you would have to be licensed for that backend service. And then the API is only going to return the things that you're authorized for based on the authentication that you pass through.
Got it. And then we did have another question that just popped in from Jen. And her question was, sorry if it was already answered, but could this pull JSON data from another external server, something that is also FedRAMP approved and has an API that uses XML or JSON, or does the data need to live on an internal server?
No, so that's a good question. And that, as I mentioned before, in cases where you're going to get data from both SAP and some other system, where I'm going through here and I have this trigger, whatever it is. Okay, so I have the underlying trigger that calls this HTTP request or a Power Apps trigger. I then have an action. So I could do this read bank list, which pulls data from SAP. I could then have another action that pulled data from a different system. So I could get data from multiple systems, and then I could use the data manipulation functions inside of Power Automate to go potentially even merge those two data sources and return back a consolidated data source to the end user. And that's one of the huge values of doing this orchestration piece inside of Flow, is that the complexity of calling one or more systems or calling one or more APIs from the same system gets masked in this integration process. So the actual flow that's being called by the end user and where the response has been tailored for end users, we're masking all the complexity of those calls inside of this. And where this gets really valuable is right now I'm just reading, but think about this from an update or a create perspective, right? If I had to create a new record and the data in that record, part of that was in SAP and part of that was in some other FedRAMP system, and part of that was in, was even getting recorded into SharePoint, for example, just as a record of what happened, I can send that single update call through the flow, and then in the flow itself, that integration developer can make sure that all that data gets placed into those different elements automatically, right? So this methodology of building your integration layer by using flows and then having those flows call whatever underlying systems it needs, not just SAP, but any other system, allows you to encapsulate all of that functionality in the flow and to mask all the complexity from that application developer. And so we don't really foresee that the end user app devs will go in and create their own connections and flows and modify this. Now, they may combine it, right? The app dev may take a flow that calls SAP and they may do the integration on the Power App side where they call SAP, they call some other FedRAMP system, and they do the integration themselves. So the flexibility of this platform is really huge in terms of deciding that where the integration takes place. If the integration can take place both at that API level, but the integration could also take place at the Flow or Power Apps or Power Virtual Agent level, whatever that client call is, because it may need to get access to data from multiple different systems. So again, there's a whole kind of thought process around how should I model and create my APIs. But once you have done that, the focus needs to be on both maintaining the integrity of the backend system, but also making it as simple as possible for end users to use a set of flows and to make these calls.
Awesome. And then I know you've probably got some more content. We did get one more question, so we'll do that, and then we'll switch back to what you want to cover for the rest of it. But this was from Josh, also same person that wanted to see this integration. So Josh, awesome to see you in this session. His question was, is there a BAPI that can call the user's SAP accesses so a Power App can be designed to only display the features available to the active user? So I think the ask is, can you make it aware in Power Platform of what those users could do in SAP?
That I don't know the answer to. John Gilman, is that something you could answer?
Yes, yeah, and as part of our acquisition of Clear Software, that is functionality that will be brought over into Power Automate as a template that our customers can reuse. But essentially, it will query the authorization objects assigned to a user and return it to Power Apps. And then within Power Apps, you can use your conditional logic to determine whether or not buttons or fields should be displayed or made required or hidden, all that fun stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
And that's actually an excellent segue into the last topic we're going to cover. So as John mentioned, we acquired his company called Clear Software last October. The idea is to make this entire process much simpler. So what I did was go through and manually build out a flow that would be able to map a particular BAPI. What John's company has done is they will be delivering thousands of APIs, over 4,000 APIs that are already predefined. So if I just want to call get a bank and update the bank, I simply have to go through and say, show me the bank API, and all of the work to go do this modeling will come back in, and then you can take that template, if you will, and modify it if you need to do something different. Okay, and so the idea also is that there would be then applications, so Power Apps that would massage these APIs as well. So if you're not sure how to get a value back from the API or what to do with it once you get it back, then there's even a sample app that you can go call and look at that would help you go through and modify the underlying API. So what I have shown you so far is the kind of Stone Age way to do it. And John and his company are going to take us into the information age of doing this, which is I pick the API based on the function that I want, whether it's a bank management or a notification or some kind of a dispatch. And then I have a set of APIs that I can simply bring into my application that are predefined and I can modify. So it's going to be much easier going forward to go through and just import one of these pre-delivered API flows and modify it and then consume it in something else. The other part of this acquisition that's key is that it's very complex when you go to set up an API. So for example, you might have 30 or 40 parameters you have to call and a couple of hundred fields you have to modify. And so a lot of the work that John's team is doing is modifying the UI inside of Flow so that you only see the things that you have to modify to make the API work, instead of having 300 or 400 empty values there that you have to figure out how to use. And so you can always add new ones, but you don't have to go through and do some really complex things with the API. So again, the whole function of the acquisition that we're doing with Clear is to allow us to rapidly select by function rather than even have to understand the specific name of the underlying API. So it'll make the initial thing much easier to build. And then the other piece of this is the connection itself. I mentioned earlier that the connection itself, one is created for each user, but defining that connection is still fairly complex in the current implementation. And so we'll be dramatically simplifying that so that an IT admin can create a connection profile, and that connection profile will use things like SAP load balancers, and that single connection profile can be shared across multiple users and flows inside of an environment. And now as an end user, I simply have to go through and say, I want to create a connection based on this profile. And then here are my credentials, and it makes it dead kill simple just to create a connection that goes to the right endpoint. And then finally, there are some capabilities that we need as part of calling SAP. So, there are cases in SAP where, the string arrays that come back from SAP are not easily consumable by the Power Platform. So, what this will do is allow you to call a single function from inside a flow that will break binary and text data into arrays that can be easily consumed by an integration developer. There are some cases where SAP functions require leading zeros, and so rather than require you to do that, there'd be a function to add leading zeros, right? And so again, there's a whole series of specialized functions that will be coming as part of this acquisition that will make things a lot easier for this integration developer to use to build this agility layer.